Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about yo ni naru, yo ni suru, koto ni naru, and koto ni suru. Now all the elements of these expressions we've already learned, so what we need to do now is to see how they fit together in these cases, what they mean, and why they mean what they mean. So let's just do a quick recap of ni naru and ni suru. As we know, the two primordial Japanese verbs, kai, hao, and se. Aru is the mother of self-meaning verbs, and suru is the father of all other verbs. Naru is closely related to aru. Aru means be, naru means become, so we can say that aru and naru are the static and dynamic versions of the same verb. That is, the same verb being still and moving in time. Now, ni naru, where we use a noun followed by ni naru, we know that something turns into that noun. Ni marks the target of the transformation, and naru is the transformation itself, the becoming. So when we say yo ni naru, well, we looked at yo last week, didn't we? And we saw that when we're comparing things or likening things, yo means a form or a likeness. Its basic meaning is a form or a state of being. When we say rikishi wa yama no yo da, sumo wrestler is like a mountain, we are not saying the sumo wrestler is a mountain, we're extracting the form or the state of being of the mountain and applying it to the sumo wrestler. We're not saying that the sumo wrestler is the mountain, we're saying that the wrestler is the mountain's yo, the mountain's form or state of being. So in English we say the wrestler is like the mountain. In Japanese, we say the wrestler is the form or the state of being of the mountain. We might say the likeness of the mountain. Now, when we use yo in the expressions we're talking about today, we don't add them to a noun like yama. We add them to a complete logic clause. The textbooks sometimes say that we're adding them to a verb, but what we're really doing is adding them to a logical clause with a verb engine. But yo, as we know, is a noun. The logical clause becomes the adjectival, a descriptor for that noun. So we know that any verb engine, together with the logical clause it heads, can become an adjectival. So we're not saying no yo, we're not saying the likeness of something else here. So we have a logical clause plus yo ni naru. We are saying that something became or entered the state of being or the form of that logical clause. So, for example, if we say kare o shinjiru yo ni natta, we're saying I've came to believe in. Kare o shinjiru or zero ga kare o shinjiru, I believe him, is a logical clause, and we're saying that I moved into the state, I became the state of that logical clause. I came to behavior. This is often used with the potential helper verb. For example, we might say, Nihongo no manga ga yomeru yo ni natta. Japanese manga became readable to me. As you see, in both cases, something is changing its state. I changed my state from not believing him to believing him. The manga changes its state from being non-readable to being readable. In all cases, we are talking about a change of state, a change of the existing state in someone or something from one condition to another. And if you're wondering why we most often in Japanese speak of the manga changing state from being readable to non-readable, rather than speaking as in English we usually do of the person changing state from not being able to read the manga to being able to read the manga, please watch the video lesson on the potential helper verb, where I explain how this works. Now, when we say yo ni suru, you know that the ni suru construction is the other mood version of the ni naru construction. If we say Majo ga sakura wo kaeru ni shita, we are saying the witch turned Sakura into a frog. So yo ni suru is to make something enter a state. It doesn't enter it by itself. Someone is making it enter a state. So if we say yoku mieru yo ni suru, yoku mieru means to look good. So yoku mieru yo ni suru is to make someone or something look good. Now, yo ni suru has an extended sense. And that is when we say something essentially equivalent to please make sure that you do something. So, we can say do ni kagi o kakeru yo ni shite kudasai. And that means please just so that you lock the door. And I think you can see the difference here between simply saying do ni kagi o kakeru kudasai, which is just please lock the door. In one case, you're kind of assuming that the person will simply lock it as a matter of course. In the second case, you're making a very special point of it. Please make it so that you lock the door. This is important, so please make it be that way. It, in this case, is just the same as it would be in English, the situation, the circumstance. Please turn the circumstance from one in which you don't lock the door into one in which you do lock the door. So this makes a very special point of this instruction or advice. Now, related to this is when you may say something about yourself, usually related to something you do regularly, such as saying, Mainichi haruku yo ni suru. And that means literally, I make it so that I walk every day. But when you put it this way, rather than just saying Mainichi aruku, which is simply saying I walk every day, the implication is that you try to do so. You might not necessarily always succeed. But you see, as with the other usage, there's some doubt as to whether you will do it. You don't say, please make it so that you lock the door, unless there is in your mind a certain doubt as to whether this is going to happen and you're trying to make it so that it does. When you say it about yourself, Mainichi araku yo ni suru. There's also another factor in play, in that when it's yourself, you could also use koto ni suru. And that expresses a firm decision, which we'll talk about next week in the second half of this lesson. So if you choose yo ni suru over koto ni suru, you're inherently leaving a little room for doubt. Now, yo ni can also be used with a clause behind it and a clause in front of it in order to say do one thing in order that another thing may happen. The text works treat this as if it were a different piece of grammar, a different grammar point. But in fact, it isn't. It's the same as plain yo ni suru. And the only reason it seems a bit different is because we put it a little differently in English. But we shouldn't be thinking about English, we should be thinking about Japanese. So let's take a look at how this works. Let's take a sentence that we've already had. Yoku mieru yo ni suru. Make something or someone look better. Now let's change that to Yoku mieru yo ni kujive ni otsukeru. In order that she will look better, or I will look better, or someone will look better, apply lipstick. Now, as you see, in English, the ways of putting those two ideas are different, and that's why textbooks and the conventional explanations talk as if we have two separate, unrelated grammar points. But if you look at what's going on, you can see that they're actually the same thing. In one case, we're saying, make someone or something look better, without specifying the means. by just using the neutral textual sir, which is the fundamental other word. When we say yoni, kuchibeni on sukkeru. Kuchibeni on sukkeru is simulating the sura. Instead of unspecifically saying, simply make someone look better, it's say, do a specific thing in order to make someone look better. Now, suru is also an action, it's just an unspecified action, it's just do, act, make something happen. Kuchibeni on sukkeru specifies what that suru might be in a particular case. So you see, you have exactly the same construction here, not two separate grammar points, as they like to call them. And one final note is that you will sometimes hear yoni on the end of a sentence, usually a massive ending sentence. This is used primarily for prayers and petitions. So you might say, the homely ikemas yoni, and you might say that at a shrine, or when you're wishing on a falling star, or perhaps just when you're expressing a wish that a friend might be able to go to Japan. Might we use this? Well, obviously it's a kind of shortening of yoni suru if you're talking to a deity or a fairy. It might be short for yoni shiteku jasai. So next week, we move on to koto ni naru and koto ni suru. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. And I'd like to thank my good Kokeshi patrons who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and starfists on Patreon and everywhere. I value you all so much, and I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. Torikara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Carsten Smith.